Okay, my name's Mark Macrae. I'm a solution architect with Capgemini, originally from London, and I moved to New Zealand 2018. And I'm a certified Power Platform architect and Azure architect. And the reason for both of those is because I've found increasingly that in projects, both Power Platform and Azure come hand in hand together. As you can see from my slide, I'm into West Ham Football Club and retro computer games, and fighting games probably got something a little bit to do with watching West Ham over the years. Okay, so agenda for this session. Initially, we're going to what I call knowing your apps, but basically knowing your application and the environment, looking at a typical project security timeline and what we can do to improve it. Then we'll look down into Power Platform itself, integration points, and the software development lifecycle, and then sum up with maybe my top 5 tips for applying security. Okay, now in projects, we're kind of typically, you kind of either hear from other people typically, or maybe if you're lacking a bit of experience, you may say this yourself, but basically Microsoft handles it all. It's a SaaS product and we don't have to worry about security. Microsoft do everything for us. And that's true to a point, but only if we literally did nothing with Power Platform and we didn't integrate it with anything else. Now, as we probably know, that a SaaS application, software as a service, the vendor usually manages everything for us, which is true. So if you were to buy Dynamics 365 or even Power Platform and you did very little with it and you just used it, yes, Microsoft would handle pretty much all the security that you potentially need. However, most of the applications that I see being implemented have some kind of Azure element. There's like either a key vault being used or a storage account maybe. And once you start getting into that, you're getting into PaaS, platform as a security, and your responsibility really is to look after that data and the applications there. And also quite commonly, most of the apps that we build on Power Platform kind of either bridge across both of those. And also Power Platform itself is kind of known as an application platform as a security, as a service. So you're buying a platform to build applications on, and Microsoft provide the platform for you. You build the applications, and then essentially, your responsibility is for making sure those applications are secure. So it's a shared responsibility, and that's the best way to look at it, is that it's shared between yourself and Microsoft, the vendor. Out the box, yes, Microsoft do provide quite a robust security under the hood for everything that your application runs on. So all of the infrastructure, all of the data that you have there is encrypted, both where it sits and also as it moves around Power Platform. There's data isolation, there's protection against common attacks. So your portal will be protected against common DDoS attacks and things like that. And it also adheres to a wide range of certifications like ISO 27001, which is the most common security classification or certification that you can get. Also provides you with a built-in authorization model, so you can allocate your users to various security roles, business units and teams accordingly, so they've got access to the data that they need to have. So yes, as a SaaS level, Microsoft provide that kind of base infrastructure, so if you did nothing, you'd still have a good level of security and protection. Then you build your custom applications on top, and then Microsoft provide some features and managed environments for you to put your applications into, essentially. So that top layer is kind of where we're focusing on more for this presentation. Now, commonly, if we think of a project where we're building something on Power Platform or any other tool, really, typically security is left right into the end. So if you're from a vendor like Capgemini, like I am, quite often you'll see people going yes, yes, yes to the RFP requirements, but not specifically the non-functional requirements like the security. Will it do this and will it do that? Yes, 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 without really thinking about it too much. Then the discover, design, and develop and test are mainly focused on the functional requirements. And right before the release, you'll have a security pen test, and there'll be some remediation items off the back of that. Now, what we should be doing is looking at security right from the very beginning. So if you are responding to an RFP, be precise with your requirements and challenge the requirements. I've seen some requirements for security NFRs, refer to an entire security catalog of controls. For example, like the New Zealand security requirements. Does your application comply with all of them? And people go, yeah, it's fine. But actually, you need to really be a bit more precise and challenge the vendors to which requirements they're actually specifically looking at. Now, when you get into the discovery phase, that's where, as well as discovering the functional requirements, you should be discovering the non-functionals and understanding any environments and constraints that your client's environment or your development environment may impose on you. That's where you need to be kind of establishing like contact with the security architect at the client or the in your business. Establish contacts with all of your vendors, understand who manage each of the components and of the architecture that you're looking to potentially build into. And then when you move into the design phase, set yourself up for success there too. So establish like an ALM policy there, make sure that you can push small changes through from development to test and so forth. Set up your security principles that you need for anything that you're going to be integrating with, and build your design authentication and integration points. So think about what apps you're going to be integrating with and what authentication needs you're going to be using. Then when you get into the development and test, you can be looking at your Power Platform security dashboard, which we're going to talk about shortly. Document the NFRs and how you're meeting them. A lot of people don't do that, so you get to the end and the NFRs, if they do get forgotten about, it'll be like, oh, do you do this and how do you do this? And you'd be like, okay, not quite sure. But if you document along the way, it's a good practice to have. Review the implementation that you're doing. Make sure that you're reviewing that with the security architect, and he's along with it or she's along with the journey that you're making. And then when you do get to the security pen test, you're much more prepared than what you would have been in the previous slide. Another point which I think is quite important is to know the customer and the data, and that allows you to apply security accordingly. So, for example, if there's a difference between writing a small application that doesn't integrate with anything that is contained within your environment, to perhaps writing an enterprise scale application for the US Army or something. So, you wouldn't apply the same security controls on each of those projects. So really understand the data and the documents that you're working with. Understand, are you working with, for example, how's your data classified? So in most instances in New Zealand in the cloud, especially if it's government, it will be of a certain level because that's what's been signed off for the risk of putting data into the cloud in the first place. Whereas if you're in a private organization, potentially you might be working with higher level data, security data. So just check what the data is. Is there any privacy in there? Is there any banking data, that sort of thing? How mature is your customer with security, or how mature are you with your security? So, do they have a security architect? Do they already have security practices in place? What is their Azure landscape like? What's the vendor? Get in touch with the vendor and speak to somebody there. And establish the appropriate level of security for what you need. So it's not a one size fits all. Now we're going to have a look at some of the tools that we've got to be able to manage security in your environments. So first of all, we're going to look at the Power Platform. And the first thing that I would draw attention to is the Microsoft well-architected framework. So it's the set of best practices and architecture guidance and review tools that helps the design of modern application workloads with Power Platform. And one of the pillars there is security, but there are other pillars as well, such as your reliability and performance. So there's a framework there. Not many people that I come across actually have read it or understand it or are even aware of it potentially. But it's definitely something that you should be across. Underpins everything that you do, and is always a good base point to refer back to and base decisions on. Now, from that well-architected framework, Microsoft have built a suite of tools that allow you to tweak security permissions more finely tuned to your specific application within the Power Platform. So the first thing is that you will see in the Power Platform Admin Center a security blade. And when you click on that, the first page that you'll see is a security dashboard, and it will give you a score. And it will give you a list of things that it's recommending that you tweak. Now, I think that admins should be reviewing this on a regular basis. Again, I still see some people either not aware of it or don't review or check it on a regular basis. They might check it once off and then leave it, but definitely do a good thorough review of that and all of the points that it's recommending for you. And what essentially you'll do there is you'll need to tweak things and switch things on to increase your score. Now, with this, in my view, the goal is not to reach 100%. The goal is to reach somewhere above 60, I would say. 60 to 100, and probably not even 100. And that is because, again, it depends on what your environment is like, what your data is like, what you're protecting, essentially, as to what you need to switch on. So you don't need to switch everything on and get a medal for applying with everything. You need to really fully understand everything, understand the consequences of what you're doing, and then go ahead and switch things on once that's the case. Now, I wanted to go through a couple of things that do not need managed environments. So I'll talk about managed environments shortly, but I wanted to just touch on a couple of areas that you can tweak without needing a managed environment. So the first thing is a data policy, and the data policy allows you to control data that's going in and out of your solution, and usually that's through some kind of connector to a data source, and Power Automate in particular would be one way of using such a connector to either push data into Dataverse or use data in Dataverse to drive something else like a third-party API or something like that. Now, I would definitely say if you don't already have a data policy, to look at setting it up. It's quite easy to do so. All you really do is you go in here and you connect, you specify which connectors can be used. So some are blockable, so you can block them. And some you can put into categories. So you can say they're either business kind of critical connectors, or they're not non-business connectors. And you can list the ones which are to be used within your organization or not. So you can do that. You can also configure some endpoints. So if you have got like an HTTP connector, you can, rather than just switch it on, you can say, okay, I'm going to switch it on, but I'm only going to allow people to connect to this API because that's all they should be using that connector for. And the same for SQL Server. I'm only going to allow people to connect to a specific database. And you could have different policies for different environments. So you could have one for development that points to a development database, and you can have one for test that points to a test database. So definitely worth looking at that. There are such things as environment security groups, so you can restrain users from certain environments. And this one feels like a no-brainer, but it's I still see a lot of our customers that don't use this. So they'll have, say, a dev, test, UAT in a production environment, and they won't have groups assigned. So if you assign someone a Power Platform license or a Dynamics license, they instantly get allocated to all the environments. And that's not an ideal scenario. You really want to be, assigning users to a specific environment. So if you've got, say, 20 testers, they should only be put into and allocated to a test environment. So that's something you can do without requiring any managed environments. Now, if I look at managed environments, what that is essentially is that Microsoft provide an additional layer on those environments that you declare to be managed. So there's more visibility, there's more insights available for those environments, there's more controls that you can tweak, and essentially less effort for you to manage. So there's more that's done by Microsoft and less that's done by you. So there's this kind of a that kind of trade-off there. And if your users are already premium, what Microsoft call premium license holders, so they're Power Platform, they're a Power Apps premium license holder, or they're a Dynamics 365 license holder, then they're already qualified. There's no additional cost other than that to switch an environment to be managed. And if that's the case, I would definitely recommend you doing it. There's not really any downsides for doing it. And certainly for your production and non-production environments is worth doing. And you get extra features. So one of the most useful features that I've found is Azure Virtual Networks, and being able to purely connect to an Azure Virtual Network. Now, this comes in handy when you've got some integration points with Azure. And previously to this, you would need to keep say, for example, if you were connecting to an Azure Key Vault, say with a Power Automate connector, you'd need to keep your Key Vault public, because the Power Platform would need to be able to access that Key Vault. And you could lock it down with firewalls and various IP addresses, but there's so many IP address ranges that you need to kind of track that with Microsoft, because those IPs change on a fairly regular basis. And you could use some kind of naming conventions for that to help you. But essentially what this does allows you to set up a VM, a virtual network of your own, and declare in Azure of what can access that. So what you're essentially doing is say, hey, Power Platform, you can connect to this Key Vault, but you can only go in via these VNets and this subnet, and makes things a whole lot more secure, and you don't have to worry about declaring your own or restricting your own firewall rules and IP addresses and so forth. So it's something that's really useful that's available with a managed environment. Other areas that are available, so you can manage an IP firewall to restrict access to Dataverse. So you can say, okay, I only want users in my organization, so anyone who's connecting through our company VPNs to go through this firewall, everyone else can be bounced. Or, these customers or this portal address or whatever it might be. So that's quite useful. I can manage the sharing of Canvas apps and flows, so I can allow people to share, which is kind of the default setting, or I can say actually only these certain people can share these apps, or these roles can share these apps and so forth. So it's quite useful to have as well. I can manage the customer managed keys that encrypt your data. So out of the box, Microsoft will have the key. They'll hold the key to your data for you. If you want to be a bit more controlling over your data and not risk letting Microsoft have the keys, you can provide your own keys, and you can manage those keys here on that managed environment. So you can have a different key per environment as well. IP address based cookie binding is something that you can set up. Again, it's an example where there's an additional threat that's managed by Microsoft if you set that up. And what Microsoft is saying basically is that we'll do all this extra stuff for you, but we want to make sure that we're doing it where we're getting, people paying licenses, because it does cost us money, and we don't want to do it for free, essentially. So, okay, let's just divert slightly onto the Power Pages. So if you've got a Power Pages portal, again, there's another kind of layer specific to web applications. So yes, you can do another security check, and you can make sure that your web application is all the right things are switched on, because again, similar to Power Apps, Microsoft provide that base foundation layer, but for your specific portal, there are extra things that you can do to configure HTTP headers and things like that. And the most, again, understand the users, understand who's going to be using your portal and where they're going to be using it. So if it's a partner portal and you know your partners, that's going to be a little bit more secure than an internet-based portal where you don't know who's using it and you've got a lot of pages that have got anonymous access. I would restrict anonymous access to just static content only. So I still see some portals where a lot of users have anonymous access, and they can go in and create forms and submit forms and that sort of thing. I would strongly discourage that, and make sure that people sign in to submit any kind of data or view any kind of data, basically, and you can control the roles that they see. Avoid local authentication. I still see a lot of portals where there's just a username and password, which is kind of the local. It's called local authentication out of the box. And essentially, what happens is the credentials are kind of stored locally in the Power Platform, but Microsoft do actively discourage using that. It's still supported, but there's still warnings when you look at that on their documentation, asking you to not use it. And I would strongly advise you to do the same. So it's quite easy to set up the Google authentication even, or Microsoft Entra ID authentication. So it's quite easy to set that up now. There's really no need to use a local authentication. Make sure you configure your session timeouts. So don't have pages that are kind of, someone uses your application in a cafe and then they just run off and leave it open and it's just left there indefinitely. Make sure you do use those timeouts and configure those. And again, they're easy things to do. Configure the HTTPS headers, including a content security policy. So a content security policy, what that does is it allows you to configure specific kind of origins of for images and CSS and JavaScript and so forth, so that people can't inject those assets into your web page and pull, non-standard data through to your application. So it's again another way of securing that, and that's a lot easier to configure now in the new admin center for Power Pages. Configure MIME types if you're using file uploads, because again, somebody might go into a internet cafe or an unregulated machine and just upload a file. You don't know how clean that file is, so you've got to make sure that you do have some restrictions on that. Now, if it's a professional application, you probably want to look at having some additional anti-malware introduced. We've typically used anti-malware that's available in Azure storage accounts, and definitely put your non-production sites into a private mode, so that especially while they're being developed, that nobody is looking at those sites and looking at how they can actually try to work out what your site is doing and what the purpose of it is as it's being built. And check your security scan frequently. So that's something that's available within Power Pages. Now, I get a lot of people ask me, what should I use the WAF and should I switch it on? And some people are quite confused that maybe the Power Pages doesn't have a WAF to begin with. So the first thing is that Microsoft does provide a WAF for Power Pages out of the box. So there is a WAF there. It uses Azure Front Door, and but its rules are general. So they may be, for example, general rules to prevent against DDoS attacks and so forth. And what they're essentially offering you is to extend that by providing your own custom rules for your own application, your own portal. So first thing is to kind of just avoid that confusion that Microsoft don't provide a WAF, they do. And in addition to that, you can set up your own set of rules, and the rules are based around three kind of types. Either some kind of geolocation, so allow or block people coming from this country or this region. Same thing, but at a more granular level for IP address, and a similar thing for URIs. So kind of a block access to this path or only allow these paths, that kind of thing. So that allows you as an administrator to go in there and configure those things. Now, if we look at integration points, so we kind of covered Power Platform itself, and what to do next is just touch on integration. So where your application integrates with another application, or maybe something in Azure. And the first thing to do is consider the credentials or the authentication that you're using between the Power Platform and your application that you're integrating with, or your API that you're integrating with. And I still see a lot of applications that use standard credentials, user ID and password, that are kind of stored in some kind of setting in Dataverse, and the application maybe goes there and pulls that out and then uses it. So that's okay, but only where it's not supported to use any of the other methods. And ideally, you should be using some kind of managed identity, because again, the credentials or the secrets are managed by Azure, and you don't have to worry about it as an administrator. They're not stored anywhere. The next level down is a service principal, where you create some kind of application in Entra ID, and then you'll have a secret, client ID and client secret, which again you'll typically store in like a key vault somewhere, and have to be renewed every couple of years or sooner. So that's the next best level, but it's you still have to manage and maintain those secrets. And then the third level is some kind of service accounts, where essentially that's an account that a human can type in a user ID and password to log in somewhere. And typically with that, if that's used within like a flow to access a particular application, then you wouldn't want MFA on that. You'd want to take MFA off, and that's why it's kind of quite frowned upon, and a lot of organizations will need some kind of special security clearance to get that. There are some Power Platform connectors that don't support service principal or a managed identity. So SharePoint, I think, still requires a user to access. So if you're using like a SharePoint connector, you'll need a user ID and password. But there's not many left. So there's a few connectors that still require that. So just only use that sparingly, and I say use that kind of order of preference, ideally. Also think about the connectors that you're using for Power Automate. Now, again, like I mentioned earlier, that some connectors don't use or don't support a managed identity or a service principal yet. So you would need to use a dedicated account for that. And again, if you do go down that road, use the principle of least privilege. So you only give it the permissions that it needs to have. So if it needs to read specific SharePoint tables, or it needs to put some data into a SharePoint library, and it needs to be able to read some Dataverse tables, then just give it those permissions. Don't be tempted to give it sort of admin permissions and so forth, because that's a vulnerability. So yeah, check the authentication options on your connectors. Don't reuse connector credentials. If you do, don't reuse them, or even don't reuse service principals for non-production and production. So keep those separate. And store any service principal keys, store them in a key vault as secrets. Now, if you do have Azure resources, and most people increasingly do now, so you'll have some kind of key vault, or you'll have a storage account. You might also have an API or something like that. You'll need to think about how you're protecting those, because that's where that comes into the PaaS bracket. So you're then moving from SaaS into PaaS, and that kind of platform security where you've got to manage that yourself. So have a think about the resources that you need and how you're going to do that. Map out the traffic that you've got between Power Platform and Azure, and all of the points that are vulnerable. I'll bring up an example diagram shortly and explain that a bit more. But yeah, make sure you're using any endpoints that are exposed. Make sure there's some kind of WAF to protect them against any traffic, and restrict your key vault and storage as much as possible. So where you're using key vault to store keys for Dataverse to access, use that feature on a managed environment that I spoke about earlier, to make sure that's not open to the public. Now, if we move on to the software development lifecycle, many of you should use some kind of SDLC, some kind of tooling. Usually it will be DevOps. Potentially you're using the tooling that's included with Power Platform. Now we typically still use DevOps because you get a lot more control over the settings and things like that you're using. But and there you can define, teams that have got access to certain pipelines. Make sure there's a good code branching strategy. There's a good minimum number of reviewers for your pipelines. Make sure your environments are documented well and they're kind of aligned. Lock them down where possible. So, you're not letting junior developers deploy to a production environment. You're using the controls and the properties within DevOps to lock that down and prevent that from happening. Link to Azure Key Vault with variables. So don't just have credentials stored in Key Vault to access things like Dataverse for deployments. So use Key Vault to store those and link that with DevOps. Yeah, and as I said, just make sure that only certain teams can deploy certain pipelines. Alerting and monitoring is also something that's often overlooked and doesn't always come hand in hand with security, but it helps the security immensely and the traceability of things. So it's not just for application logging, but it's also for tracking and monitoring of security events. So some organizations, some larger organizations will have what's called a SIEM, which is a security event information management system, like a Microsoft Sentinel type application. And that allows you to link it up with some logs, like, logging into Power Pages portal and match on patterns. So if people are trying to log in and trying to hack in, the Sentinel will pick it up and report it to your security people, and that's quite a good thing to have if you already have a SIEM. But also provide clear messages. There's nothing worse than trying to debug an error and you're getting some weird messages that could be anything. So starts with your developers to be clear in the code. Grade the severity of the errors, escalate where necessary, and you can do your own kind of alerting with Azure Monitor to alert and react to certain error messages. Now I would the top 5 things. So there's a lot of data there that I've kind of gone through and a lot of information. And what I would pick out as my top 5, if you don't have done none of this, is one is just to manage your credentials better. So make sure that all of the interactions between Power Platform and other applications, be it your portal, be it Azure, be it an API, whatever it is, just document what you've got currently and document how you're connecting to it and what authentication mechanisms you're using, and that will at least give you a starting point to try and attack where you can improve. Number 2 would be to consider using managed environments. So if you're not already using them, switch it on. You can always switch them off again as well, but switching on, even if it's in a dev environment, just to see what there is quite useful. But you want to be aiming for production and pre-production if you've got a pre-production environment to be using managed features. What's your security score? So go and find that out now if you don't already have it or don't know it, and track that on a regular basis, because there's not just new features that Microsoft are rolling out, but there's also things that your application could do to reduce or increase your score. So definitely worth checking that and tracking it at least on a monthly basis. Number 4 would be to read all of the well-architected framework documentation. Whether you're an architect or not, it's very important and helps everyone on the project understand, what underpins your application, because at the end of the day, it's Microsoft's platform and they adhere to that framework. So you kind of have to as well. And then finally, implement a data policy, 1, because it's dead easy to do so, and 2, because it instantly protects or ups the level of your data protection, stops data leakage and inadvertently people using flows that are connecting and pushing your data somewhere you don't want it to be, especially if it's offshore. Okay, now what I wanted to do before I finish was just to let me just bear with me a second. There we go. And I'm just going to quickly share a diagram. Here's an example of a diagram that shows some integration points between Power Platform and Azure. So as a solution architect, this is what I would be doing. So you can see on the left-hand side here, we've got our different Power Platform tenants applications. So we've got a portal here, and you can see a portal pushing out to an Azure B2C tenant for authentication with RealMe, which is like a New Zealand government authentication provider. We've also got our portal coming into Azure, so it's coming into our landing zone via like a public IP, and you can see that we've got these two APIs here, and they're protected by an application gateway and a WAF. We've also got our Power Apps model-driven apps here, and obviously users are coming in potentially. So as an example, in this particular occasion, this app served to as like a conduit out to like a New Zealand Post API out here. So we might have controls both on the portal and also on a model-driven app that allow people to type addresses in and get them validated by NZ Post. So there's our kind of architecture for that. And you can see down here we've got Power Automate, and you can see the connectors that we're using in these cases. So we're using like a Key Vault connector, and we're also using an HTTP connector to connect out to that same API via flows. And all of these kind of diagrams allow you to home in on the vulnerabilities, if you like, of your other systems. So this will be your SaaS environment here, and this Azure environment will be your PaaS environment. And the PaaS environment is what you've got to try to protect a little bit more, because out of the box, it's not going to be as secure as you may need it to be. So that's why we've put an application gateway. It could be a front door, could be an application, an API manager, but whatever it is, this helps you to understand your application, especially where you've got lots of integration points and where your data is stored. And there's lots of features and applications to be able to help you manage that. So yeah, that's me. I will, if there's any questions, let me know. Thank you, Elena. That's good. Yeah, if there's any questions, let me know. If not, then thank you for listening. And hopefully I wasn't too heavy for a Friday afternoon. Well, good. Thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend.